Check 1 2, check 1 2. Check 1 2, check 1 2. Check one, two, check one, two. 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 Check one, two, check one.
Okay, we're gonna get started. On yeah, okay. All the people in the hallways, please come in. We get started again. Yeah, well, okay, can John Armstrong gonna be on with it? There's John. Hi, John. How you doing?
Hi, Ben. I'm great.
Hey,
How are
John.
you? Hi, Ben.
Okay, so at this time, John is gonna be speaking, and he's gonna be talking about simple terms of the treaty, impressions left by the commissioners. So by virtual, I'd like to present John Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen here first. Make sure I get this right. Can everybody see my presentation on the screen? I think so. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Dr. Janet Armstrong. I would very much like to thank the NAN executive for inviting me to present today. I'm honored to be here. I'd like to thank the elders for having the patience to listen to me. I'd like to thank the chiefs, youth, and the women. and I'm so honored to be a part of this gathering. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself before I launch into my presentation. So my name is Dr. Armstrong. I've been researching Treaty Number 9 and Treaty Number 5 for over 30 years now. I have had the privilege of traveling all through Northern Ontario and Treaty 9 territory and Treaty 5 with our respected elder Louis Bird. This was years ago, 20 years ago I did this. So much of what I'm going to say to you today with respect to the elder's understanding, I have to give credit to Louis, because without him I still would be back in grade 1 of treaties. I've worked on many land claims on behalf of NAN Treaty First Nations. A lot of treaty land entitlement claims, and other claims involving reserve land. I was also the independent academic advisor to the NAN Canada treaty table. And that was a great experience because I was able to work with Wally, whom I hope is doing okay. And I worked with Wally and Ben and Simon Frog and others. So I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm anxious to share a little bit of information with you. I'm sure you already know a lot of what I'm about to say, but I might give it to you in a way that's a little bit different or unique. The reason my topic is the simple terms of the treaty came about in a few ways. First of all, because I'm an academic, I spent too many years in university. And in universities, we tend to approach treaties as complicated matters that require books to understand. And we tend to get sucked into the legalese of treaties. I hope I'm okay for the interpreter. I'll slow down if I have to. So we end up, debating what fiduciary means or other legal terms, and the role of the province and the role of the Dominion, or what certain legislation means over the decades. And so I went down that rabbit hole along with my fellow academics. But here now, some 35 or maybe longer years later, I come back to the basics of the treaty, because after all, that's what it really comes down to. What was said, what was in the written text, and what did people understand? So if we kind of get rid of all the noise surrounding the treaty, that's what I wanted to focus on. I'm going to have to deviate a little bit in my talk back into that legalese part, the legal part, only because that is what was driving the government officials of the time. But I'll try and make it short and sweet and to the point, and then we can get back to the simple terms of the treaty. So, first of all, here's a map showing Treaty 9. As you will notice, it's a huge portion of land. It's the largest portion of land covered by treaty in Ontario. Next, basic facts. Who was the treaty made between? So, if you look at the text of the treaty, it says it is made between His Most Gracious Majesty, the King of Great Britain and Ireland. And this is King Edward VII. There's a lovely picture of him. Every time I see this picture, I can't stop but noticing the beautiful fur around his collar. I'm sure that fur came from your territory. I think that's also a fur on the floor there. So this guy, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. If you look on the Wikipedia page about him, he was not really known for his intellect. He was more known for being a playboy. This might resound a little bit in today's contemporary terms. He liked to socialize. We'll put it that way. And back to the text of the treaty, it says on the other part, So it's made with the King, His Most Gracious Majesty, King Edward VII. On the other part, it's made with the Ojibwe, Cree, and other Indians, inhabitants of the territory within the said limits, by their chiefs, headmen, hereunto subscribed. Okay. Little more about who was participating. So when you look at the text of the treaty, it very explicitly states that the king is being directly represented by his commissioners. So the commissioners are there, and they're coming from Canada and Ontario, but they're direct representatives of the king. The guy on the left of the slide with his hand up to his face is Duncan Campbell Scott. He was the lead commissioner. He was a rising bureaucrat at the Department of Indian Affairs. He began as their accountant, but rose over the years to become the most prominent, or I guess important, Treaty 9 commissioner. The guy in the middle is Daniel George McMartin. He was the guy that was appointed to represent Ontario, but again, he's representing Ontario, but the larger thing he's representing is the king. So we hear over conversations over the years that Ontario participated in the treaty. Actually, this McMartin was given federal powers as a federal treaty commissioner. The guy on the end, and I'm sorry, that's the best picture I can get of him. He didn't like having his picture taken, I don't think. That's Samuel Stewart. He was another government official. He kept good diaries, but there's not much to say about him. He was just a good government official. Here's a picture of what things looked like once they arrived on land, because they were traveling by canoe. So this is a picture of their commissioner's tent at Fort Albany. And there you can see them all sat in front of the tent with, of course, the two constables. These were constables of the Northwest Mounted Police. And please note that the giant British flag is flying. A little more about Duncan Campbell Scott. So not only was he a rising government bureaucrat, he also was a sort of famous Canadian poet. He actually won the poetry prize, the Laureate Award in Canada for his poetry. And he actually inspired this topic because he wrote an article in 1906. So right after he concluded the 1906 round of Treaty 9, he wrote this article that appeared in Scribner's magazine. And I'm going to get to the article, but the part I'm highlighting here is in this article he said they were to make certain promises, meaning the Aboriginal people, and we were to make certain promises, meaning the commissioners, on behalf of the king. But our purpose and our reasons were alike unknowable. So, when I read this, the first time I ever read it, I was like, he's basically saying people didn't understand what the purpose of the treaty was, or why things were being done the way they were being done. That comes from this quote, a larger quote. And I'll go slow because this is the lead commissioner for Canada. This is him writing shortly after the events of what he believes occurred when the treaty was made. He writes, "What could they," meaning Aboriginal people, "what could they grasp of the pronouncement on the Indian tenure, which had been delivered by the law lords of the Crown?" I'm going to explain that in a minute. What of the elaborate negotiations between a dominion and a province which had made the treaty possible? What of the sense of traditional policy which brooded over the whole? So I'm going to try and break down what he's saying here. It's kind of shocking because basically he's saying there was a significant information gap when the treaty was made. People didn't understand the purpose of the treaty, nor did people understand all the stuff that happened before the treaty was even drafted, because it directly impacted what was in the treaty. Then he continues, nothing. So the simpler facts had to be stated, and the paternal idea developed that the king is the great father of the Indians, ever watchful over their interests, and ever compassionate. So there was no basis for argument. If you want, when I'm finished my presentation, we can read this all together, like all these three things together again. But basically, to summarize, he's basically saying the purpose of the treaty was unknown. The reason for the treaty was unknown. What could the First Nation people understand about all the stuff that had gone on between governments and the court that influenced this treaty? Nothing. All we could do was emphasize the watchful eye of His Majesty the King, and that the King was ever watchful over First Nation interests, so no basis for argument. I'm hoping that I will explain in this following presentation what that looked like when the treaty commissioners actually came to the communities. Okay, here's where I'm going to break out into the legalese that we have to know before we get into this. Before Treaty 9 was made in 1905, there was a very significant court case. It was called the St. Catharines Milling case. It started in 1885 and it went all the way up the courts, up the levels of courts, until 1888. And basically in 1888, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which at that time was the highest court in the land for Canada. It was, in fact, over in Britain, but this was, in the day, this was the court that Canada appealed to, our final appeal court. This is what the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council ended up saying in 1888. And I'll break it down a little, but this is what they said in the end. It was about Treaty 3, this court case. It said Treaty 3 extinguished any Indian title that may have existed. Whatever title the Indians held was just personal or usufructory. All land belonged to Ontario. Okay, I'm going to go through the arguments that were before the court. And I won't be long, I promise. The arguments are important because they actually still influence activities today. And really what they were about was who owns the land and what is Aboriginal title. It didn't start out that way, but that's sort of how it ended up. This court case arose because Treaty 3 was signed, but both the federal and provincial government had issued timber licenses in the treaty area to the same company. And the company was wondering, well, who actually has jurisdiction here? Which government controls this timber? And it went all the way, they took it to court, and this is how it ended up occurring. Before the courts, Sir John A. Macdonald, who was our Prime Minister at the time, and the federal government argued that since the lands were covered by Treaty 3, they were Indian lands. And the whole territory, therefore, fell under federal jurisdiction. Because in our British North America Act, or our Constitution, it says Indian lands are under the federal government. Ontario argued Indians only had a right to enjoy and use the land. So this is what they were saying. This is how they were defining Aboriginal title. Indians did not have property rights like non-Aboriginal settlers, And please excuse me for the offensive things that are being said before the court. I'm just delivering. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just trying to tell you what was going on at the time. Ontario was arguing Indians did not have property rights like non-Aboriginal settlers. And the reason that they're giving for this is because they believe, erroneously, that Aboriginal people just wander around the land with no
Whoops. Sorry.
That's okay. Aboriginal people just wander around the land. They don't actually settle in one place like we white people do. They just wander. Therefore, there's no property. They also go further and say Aboriginal people have no form of government and no system of laws. Therefore, there can be no property. So this profoundly ignorant viewpoint influenced what Ontario was arguing in the highest court in the land. According to them, Ontario, because of this, when Confederation occurred, so when Canada made its British North America Act, the land belonged to the province because it was always Ontario's land, even before Canada was created. And again, I apologize for the offensive statements. I just want to make sure I explain what was happening. Okay, so this is what I was saying, that Aboriginal people, according to Ontario, are nomadic wanderers unattached to any particular territory. As we know, what they didn't understand was the cyclical nature of land use, that people would follow the animals or follow what was needed to survive, but always within a circumscribed territory. But the non-natives, the settlers, just saw people wandering around, and they didn't have churches, they didn't have buildings, they didn't have stuff they didn't have farms, therefore they couldn't own property. They did not understand at all how Aboriginal people actually lived, and no evidence about that was ever presented to the court. In fact, the First Nation people in Canada were not before the court at all. There was no one there to express First Nations' point of view. Okay, Canada's argument, again, Canada was saying because these are treaty lands, they're federal lands, they belong to Canada. They also said the Royal Proclamation, which is the foundation document behind all treaties in Canada, gave a right and property to the Indians. And they argued once these lands are ceded, and the word ceded means surrendered, and by that they mean they're eliminating any interest you have in the land. Once these lands are surrendered by treaty, the land belonged to the federal crown. Okay, in 1883, the federal government issued a timber lease to the St. Catharines Milling Company to cut down trees in the territory covered by Treaty 3. So that's what I was saying was led to all of this thing. And Ontario also issued a timber license to the exact same company. And that's where all of this stuff started happening. But like I said, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council ended up siding with Ontario. Because of that, because it decided that the land was provincial land or belonged to Ontario, the thinking was, and I'm going to try and say it without reading slides. Ontario was saying, Canada, you went ahead and negotiated Treaty 3 without consulting us, and it's our land. And you went ahead and made all these promises involving the land, but we weren't even involved. You can't give what you don't own. So you, Canada, from now on, every time there's going to be another treaty Ontario has to be involved, and Ontario has to agree to the terms of the treaty. You can't go ahead and just make treaty with Aboriginal people involving our Ontario, involving our land and our resources without our approval. So that was the thinking right before Treaty Number 9 was made. Right after the court case in 1888, so right after the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council asserted that the land belonged to Ontario, the governments of Ontario and Canada entered into an agreement. This is called the 1894 Indian Lands Agreement. As I'm sure most of you know, we've had other Indian Lands Agreements, 1915, for example, 1986. This was the first Indian Land Agreement between Ontario and Canada. And in that agreement, they said, from now on, anytime Canada wants to make a treaty, Ontario has to be involved. Jump ahead now. So now we're getting to 1905, right before Treaty 9 is going to be negotiated. The two governments enter another agreement. This agreement is specifically about Treaty 9. It's dated July 3rd. And it's about, okay, Ontario is saying, Canada, you want to make this treaty with the First Nations in Northern Ontario? Here's our terms. Here's Ontario's terms. And there are certain things in that agreement that are not included in the treaty itself. It's appended or attached to the treaty parchment after the commissioners come home. So there were very important things in that agreement that the First Nations people were never told. One of them was no water powers over 500 horsepower could be included in a reserve. That agreement also said how many acres of land would be allotted for reserve land per person. And it also said this treaty is subject to Ontario's approval. Okay, so it was not discussed or shown to the First Nations. When the treaty was brought, if the treaty was brought, the actual parchment of the treaty, the fancy document with the fancy writing, that was drafted before the commissioners ever came to the communities. So it was drafted or written. The fancy writing was done in Ottawa. It was put on parchment and rolled up. And it was presented to First Nations people as if it was the final document. So the commissioners come to the communities with the document already made. So what happens if there's negotiations that change the terms? Nothing. The document's already written. Okay, I'm just going to take a pause for a minute here. Going back to what Commissioner Scott wrote in that Scribner's article, one of the things we saw that he wrote was, what could they understand of the decisions of the law lords of the Crown? What I just went through there, that history about the court case and about who owns the land and what is Aboriginal title, that's what Scott was referring to. Basically, he was saying all this stuff was going on in settler institutions, in the white people's court, that was deciding these big things like what is Aboriginal title, who owns the land after a treaty is made, and who owns the resources after a treaty is made. All that was going on, but what could the First Nations that we're about to make treaty with, what could they possibly understand about it all? Nothing. So that's Canada's lead commissioner saying that. I'm now going to take us through each spot that they visit and see how these simpler terms that Scott referred to were being explained. And just to recap, the simpler terms are what Scott said they actually reverted to because they knew they couldn't argue Aboriginal title with people. They knew they couldn't discuss the agreement with Ontario. So what did they do when they got to the communities? The simpler terms had to be explained. First stop, Mishkegogomeng, Osnaburg Post. This is everything in these slides coming up is coming directly from one of the commissioner's diaries when they were making the treaty. So this is coming from Commissioner Stewart. He was that guy on the very right that I only had a little dark picture of him. He was a federal bureaucrat. He was under Scott. So Scott was the lead negotiator. Stewart was the other Canadian negotiator. He writes, the Indians asked several questions as to whether they would be compelled to live on the reserve to be set apart for them, and as to whether their fishing and hunting privileges would be curtailed. So the commissioners meet, they explain in their version the terms of the treaty, and this is what is being asked of them after that explanation. Commissioner Stewart goes on being informed that they could continue to live as they and their forefathers had done, and that they could make use of any lands not disposed of by the government, they appeared to be satisfied. So let's look at this. They were told in reply, you could continue to live as you and your forefathers had always done. In other words, the way you've been living for centuries, you can continue that. Nothing's going to change. You can make use of any lands not disposed of by the government. That means any lands that are not already patented or leased or not disposed of, granted to settlers, everything around that you have. This is a picture of the feast at Mishkegogomeng. I love this picture. Look at all the food. One of the things I want to say, but I don't have time today, but I could do a whole other presentation on the protocol that was used when the treaty was actually made. Whenever the government of Canada made a treaty with Aboriginal people anywhere in Canada, or anywhere in central Canada and the West, they followed the old protocol that had always been used by the Hudson's Bay Company. So if you read the Hudson's Bay Company journals from like the 1800s, every year, once a year, the Hudson's Bay Company would provide a feast at the post. It would pay for it, like on the company's money, it would pay for the bannock, the food, the tea, etc. And that feast was a big social gathering for the First Nations people in the summertime. So when the treaty commissioners came to each post, they basically did the same thing. They had the annual feast of the Hudson's Bay Company. One important difference, and this is where I'd like to do one day a whole other presentation. When the commissioners arrived at each place, if they were arriving by canoe, you'll hear, or you'll see in the diaries, that there were gunshots going off and fusillades, they called them. People were firing their guns, people were celebrating, people would line up on the banks of the river or the lake to meet the commissioners. And it was explained to me by an elder in Pekanjicum that what this meant, and it happened at each place. This was the way people always greeted strangers. And it was the strangers coming to the land and asking permission to land. So a stranger would not just show up in First Nation territory, put their canoes on the land and start walking around and hunting. They would always meet and ask permission. And that to me is very important because that occurred at all of these water accessed Treaty 9 communities. Okay, so I didn't include it in my slides, but that in fact occurred at Mishkegogomang, that the greeting of the people at the water. Commissioner McMartin wrote in his diary, so Commissioner McMartin is the Ontario guy. He happened to be a mining expert, which is why they appointed him, because they wanted to make sure he would ensure that no valuable minerals would be included in reserve lands. This is what he writes in his diary. Mr. D.C. Scott, having stated the object of our coming, so long a distance to meet them, through Jimmy Swain as interpreter, and having ordered a feast similar to that held yearly, the Indians departed. They would give a reply in the morning. So just to recap a bit, the commissioners arrive at Mishkegogomang. They explain the object of their mission, and they emphasize they've come so long a distance on behalf of the king. And they tell the terms of the treaty, and the First Nation people said, okay, we're going to go think about it. We'll be back tomorrow. Right, okay, so this is more about the feast. At 12 noon, the Hudson's Bay bell tolled, announcing the feast was prepared. Chief Masabi, accompanied by the leading men of the band, approached the Hudson's Bay house, being requested to take seats, and asked if they had anything to say. This is another picture of all the people at Mishkegogomang in front of the Hudson's Bay Company post. Again, in the distance, you can see the the British flag flying. Chief Masabi said, "Whatever you say, we will do, Mr. Scott," and thanked them as if they were ready to sign the treaty, which they did by making their mark. Sorry, I'll go back to this one. Okay, we heard in the original article I started this presentation with by Scott. Do you remember he said, what could they possibly have known about the decisions of the law lords of the crown? What could they know about the whole sense of tradition brooding over the whole thing? And he said our purposes were unknown. So him explaining the object of the mission, we have to wonder what was understood. Because even Scott, the lead negotiator, is saying the object of our mission was unknown. Whatever was said, and obviously the part about you can continue to hunt, trap, and fish, or live as your forefathers have always done, had huge impact because Mishkegogomang signed. Next stop, Yamatung, Fort Hope Post. Commissioner McMartin writes that the commissioner said that the king had sent the commission to see how his people were and to enter into a treaty with them, and that the king wished to help his subjects and see that they were very happy and comfortable. So this to me is really important. This was repeated at every place, as we will see. They're representing themselves as direct representatives of the king who wished to help his subjects and want to make sure that the people were happy and comfortable. Commissioner McMartin writes in his journal, the king was giving them a present this year of $8 per capita, which just means per person, and an annuity forever of $4 a year. Also setting aside for their sole use and benefit a tract of land, 1 square mile to each family of 5, that no white man should put his foot on without their permission. The 1 square mile for each family of 5, I know from subsequent work that was definitely not understood at the time of treaty. 1 square mile was often interpreted to mean 1 mile by 1 mile, like a square. Even today, it's kind of hard to conceive of 1 square mile per family of 5, but just on top of not understanding how big the land would be, the commissioners were emphasizing this is your land where no white man can come without your permission. This is a picture of Munias at Fort Hope or at Yabmatang. And getting back to what was understood at the time of treaty. Munias said, I should like to consult with my aunts and cousins. If I buy as small an article as a needle, I have to pay for the same. You come here offering money we have not asked for. I do not understand and should like to have it explained. After an explanation, he, along with others, signified his assent and the treaty was signed. So this quote is very important to me. It tells me that what was being explained implied that they were getting this money in return for nothing. Because look what Munias is saying. I don't understand. If I want to even buy a needle, I have to pay for it. You come here giving me money. What do we have to give you in return? And he's given some kind of explanation. Whatever he's told, he ends up signing the treaty. According to Commissioner Stewart, this is what they were told. After very full explanations were asked by the Indians present, they were being very much concerned as to what they were expected to give up for the benefits they were to receive. It required some time to convince them that there was not something behind the terms of the agreement set forth. So we don't know what precisely was said, but whatever was said was giving the impression that there was no trick behind the treaty. That going back to the king just wanted to visit his subjects and help them be happy and comfortable. Okay, this is more from Commissioner Stewart. As Munias, one of the principal men of the band, stated, they were not giving up very much for what they were to receive. It had never been his experience to receive something for nothing. Okay, so again, I'm going back to this concept of what was being told to the First Nations at the time. Obviously, they weren't saying to the First Nation, you're going to give up Aboriginal title to all of your land, and you're going to agree to live on a reserve from here on in, and the rest of the land belongs to us. Clearly, that was not being said. This is the feast at Yabmatang. Again, it's being presented as a celebration. This time, it's the federal government that's paying for this feast, not the Hudson's Bay Company. Okay, Commissioner Stewart tells us a little bit more. Father Fafard, who was the Roman Catholic priest at Yabmatang at the time, fully explained to the Indians the nature of this treaty and the reasons for asking them to surrender their title to their unused lands. That's actually written in Stewart's diary. They're talking about unused lands. So the First Nation people must have been thinking, there is no such thing as unused land. Like, what does that even mean? Land that they don't hunt on? Next stop, Martin Falls, Ogoki. Again, the commissioners repeat. The king had sent his representatives to negotiate a treaty with them and advance their interests, as he wished all of his subjects to be happy and prosperous. Also, after they had entered into a treaty, they would get a present of $8 and granted, and 4 years from $4 every year after. So again, they're being told, we've come all this way. The king has sent us all this way to visit you. The king wants to advance your interests. He wanted all of his subjects to be happy and prosperous. This is Commissioner McMartin again. A tract of land is going to be set aside for you, for your sole use and benefit. This is again emphasizing no white man can come on this land without your permission. You're going to get 1 square mile per family of 5. On this land, you can hunt, cut wood, erect stuff without first... No man can come on there and build things or cut your wood unless you give him permission. keeping in mind, to the First Nation people, they have no idea how big this reserve is, right? Like, and we find out later, the year after the treaty, most First Nations believed the reserve was actually their traditional territory. There's a picture from the commissioners of their travels to Algonquin. Commissioner McMartin continues, after the treaty was signed, the reserve was being chosen. When it was explained to them that they could hunt and fish as of old, and they were not restricted as to territory, the reserve merely being a home for them where no white man could interfere or trespass upon. The land was theirs forever. They gladly accepted the situation and said they would settle the reserve question later on. So, King has sent his representatives all this way, wants you to be happy and prosperous. He's giving you $8 present, $4 from here on in. Don't worry about it. You can continue to use the rest of the land, all of the land, as you always have. You're going to get a piece of land where no white man can come. You're not restricted to where you can hunt, trap, and fish. Some of the Indians seem to think, just like we saw at Fort Hope, that there was something behind the offer. It seemed to them an offer was being made to give them something for which they were not expected to give anything in return. So I sit back and ask myself, what is being explained to the First Nations about what are they giving up? The explanation, however, put at rest the fears, and the money was paid to them, and they gladly accepted the terms. Okay. When I read this stuff, the simple terms that were explained, it tells me that the First Nations people would have understood that the land that's being covered by this treaty, they can continue to always use it as they always have. But what the King is doing is asking for permission to come into this land. Remember I said the protocol was always you would come in your boats, you would land at the banks of the river or the lake before you entered the person's territory. This tells me that the treaty was being understood as the government of the settler people, of the newcomers, was asking permission to enter. The land was going to be shared. The way of life, your way of life would continue, but Canada and the settlers, the newcomers are asking, can we come in your land? Now here I'm gonna, I hope Luke is in the audience because I'm gonna have to ask for his help in a minute. But I started thinking about this word share. You know, we often hear today that the elders agreed to share the land, and when I first heard this like 30 years ago, in my mind, obviously I'm not a native person, sharing the land meant to me, you get some and I get some. Like you stay over there and I'm over here. So like if you had a pie, we would cut it in half or whatever. You get your part and I get my part. But the way it would have been interpreted in either Cree or Ojibwe, Luke told me this one. I won't even try and say it. But the way it's interpreted means it's going to be used together, like sharing it amongst ourselves. Luke, I don't know if you're able to use a microphone or whatever, but maybe you could explain a little bit more.
Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I guess the term share, there's no specific word. I know when I talk to the elders, they don't really give you the answer. I mean, the actual terminology, but the closest that they come up with is to distribute. I mean, matanamagion. The other one is matanamagiwak. That means to share amongst themselves, and the other one is to use together, mamoabatistawan, or mamoabatistata. That means let's use use it together. So those are the terms that the close to, I guess, sharing. But there may be other terms, but those are the terms that the most elders will say to you when you ask them, what is the term share or sharing?
Thank
Okay.
you, Luke. That's very interesting. Okay, I really wanted to know more about this word and many other words that were used at the time. So I ordered a 1905 dictionary. I don't know if you can see it. This is a Webster's School and Office Dictionary, vintage 1905. Because I wanted to know, what did that word mean in 1905? We might have a different understanding today. This is what the dictionary says. Share means to partake with others. So that's kind of like what Luke just described. To partake with others, to have part, or a dividend. In other words, like a divided piece. So when we say the First Nation people understood that the land would be shared, that implies or infers that the land is going to be used together. It's going to be distributed among everybody. It does not mean what I originally thought 35 years ago, you get some, I get some. So I think the point is we have to be careful even today with how we use words and what we say to explain the treaty. Given the simple terms that were used by the commissioners to explain the treaty, I think we have to be extremely cautious, because we know one thing for sure. We know the signatories to the treaty were told emphatically, your land use, your way of living will not be affected. That we know for sure. Okay, thank you for bearing with me for that. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead to Fort Albany. This is Commissioner Martin. How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay, Commissioner McMartin says, it was then explained to them through interpreter James Linklater that the king had sent his representatives to enter into treaty with them, as he wished all his subjects, both whites and Indians, to be happy and prosperous. These two words, happy and prosperous, are repeated at every single stop. So this must sound really good to the First Nation people, that this generous king, this fatherly figure, has sent his representatives all this distance to come and offer us gifts, because he wants all of us to be happy and prosperous. Commissioner McMartin writes, the king wanted to set aside a tract of land for their sole use and benefit, where no white man would be permitted to trespass. He also was wishing to assist them after the signing with the $8 and the $4. This is the commissioner's tents at Fort Albany. If you research what actually occurred at this time, you'll find out that there was a tent for the federal commissioners and a separate tent for McMartin. They didn't have one tent for all three commissioners. The reason that's important is when it came time for the elders to go to visit the commissioners to discuss treaty, they always went to the Dominion commissioner's tent. Okay, more about Fort Albany. As at the other points, full explanations were given of the treaty and its provisions, and in reply, two of the Indians, Arthur Wesley and William Goodwin, spoke at length, expressing on their own behalf and on behalf of the members of the band the pleasure they felt at being brought into treaty and the satisfaction they experienced on receiving such generous treatment from the Crown. So whatever was being explained, the king was giving generous treatment. This is a portion of that address that was given at Fort Albany in syllabics. I can't interpret it, but we do have an interpretation available. Okay, jumping to Moose Factory, McMartin. I'm going to try and hurry up here along in the next few. It was explained the king had sent his representatives to make a treaty. The king wanted them to be happy and prosperous. If they entered into treaty, they would be protected. Now, this is really interesting because at Moose Factory at the time, the community was dealing with newcomers and white people making booze south of them, like near the rail line. A whole bunch of people brewing beer and alcohol, and it was making its way into the First Nations community. So being told that you're going to be protected means you're going to be protected. The government is going to step in and protect you from the non-native settlers. Also, the king sent you a present of $8, another $4 per year. You're going to get schools. We're going to educate your children. This is a picture of the people at Moose Factory. Commissioner Stewart writes, when the points of the treaty were explained to them, they expressed their perfect willingness to the terms. They were to have their hopes realized. There was now a prospect of law and order being established. Again, this goes back to the people that were bringing alcohol up to the community. John Dick remarked that one great advantage the Indians hoped to derive was the establishment of schools where their children might receive an education. This is a much later picture of the school in Moose Factory. Okay, George Tapas said they were very thankful that the king had remembered them. The Indians were to receive money, which was very much needed by the many who were poor and sick. So think about it, you guys. At each point, the commissioners are saying, the fatherly king has sent us all this way to come visit you. He wants everybody to be happy and prosperous. He's giving you a gift of $8, $4 every year. Schools. You can continue to use the land as you always have. This benevolent or generous king remembers you. The usual point on which the Indians desired full information was the effect the treaty would have on their hunting and fishing rights. So this was key at every place. Jumping ahead to New Post, that's their picture. When assured that these would not be taken from them, they expressed much pleasure in their willingness to sign the treaty, which was accordingly done, and the signatures duly witnessed. There's a picture. Commissioner McMartin says, had terms of treaty explained to them also the object of same. Remember, Duncan Campbell Scott wrote 1 year later, the purpose of the treaty was not understood. So whatever was explained to them as the object was not understood. The king had sent them a present, an annuity, provided they accepted the terms of the treaty. Also a reserve or tract of land surveyed for them in the near future. Turned out it took years later before the reserves were surveyed. They were not obliged to live on the reserve, and also allowed as of yore, so as of yesterday, as always, to hunt and fish wherever you pleased. Okay, now, these are the commissioner's diaries. We've seen what Scott said the year later. What was in the commissioner's official report back to their superiors at Indian Affairs? They write, this is what was agreed to. They agreed not to interfere with white men who might come into the country surveying, prospecting, hunting, or in any other occupation. They agreed that they must respect the laws of the land in every particular, and that their reserves were set apart for them in order that they may have a tract in which they could not be molested, where no white man would have any claims without the consent of their tribe and the government. In their joint report, notice there is not one mention of the First Nations being told that they were surrendering Aboriginal title. I'll go back to this. According to Scott, this is what was agreed to. You won't molest white men, respect the laws of the country, a reserve where no white man can come. Not one word in here about surrendering title to land. What wasn't said? No mention of the role of Ontario. No mention of the Indian Act, which had already been passed decades prior to this. No mention of Ontario's potential game and fish legislation. No mention of the word surrender. Now, I found this document. It was written in 1944, but it was written by a priest who was present when the treaty was made. And at this time, there were many arrests being made in Treaty 9 territory of First Nations people for hunting and fishing outside of season or breaking some provincial law. And the priest writes back to somebody in Indian Affairs that he witnessed the making of the treaty. And he says, I was present 40 years ago when the first treaty was made, and the Indians on James Bay, with the Indians on James Bay. I'm aware that at the end of some of the treaties, there is a clause subject, it says, subject to provincial regulations. This clause has caused much trouble. So what he's talking about is commonly known as the harvesting clause. That's the clause that says in the treaty, you can hunt, trap, and fish subject to the regulations. That subject to provincial regulations was never explained to the elders. According to our elders, Robert Lawrence of Matagami says, I do know there was no question about their hunting, you see. On the crown lands, any crown lands, they would be able to hunt as long as they could, you see. The oral treaty, reserves and traditional hunting grounds. Okay. If we look back at how things were explained, the commissioners were talking about the reserve, or the land where no white man could come. That was being discussed right in conjunction with how you can live on the land. So you're being told you can continue to hunt, trap, and fish as you always have, and this reserve is going to be for your sole use. So just you. That would logically mean the rest of the land would be shared. If this land is the land where only you own it, the rest of the land would be shared because you can continue to hunt, trap, and fish on it. Elder John Fletcher of Moose Factory, he witnessed this treaty. He said, nothing will alter your way of life. We will share this land with your people. You will not lose your culture if you sign this treaty. John Hukamulan out of Wapiskat. They had been promised help in all forms by the white people. They promised them assistance, and they used grass and the example and the waters flowing. That is how long this would last. Assistance in the form of health care and welfare and housing. They said we would have water and a house. This isn't in my slides, but I know from the elders, especially along the James Bay coast, the commissioners would point to the Indian agent's house and say, you're going to have the same. And of course, the Indian agent had the best of everything. Some land was given, but some of them said not all of it, but just to share. They use equally. The native and the non-native people use equally. Willie Wesley of Kasheshawan. What they would do, they asked for the land for them to own, and the people agreed, and everything in the future would be free for them. And the elders talked about it, and it sounded very good. Everything that would be done for them, and the things they would receive. They were never asked to give up the land forever. They were only asked for, they owned the land. They were told that they would have houses like the manager's house, the way it was in the future. Yours would be the same. But if we look at the written treaty, the one that's housed in Ottawa, it says the Indians agree to hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of the Dominion of Canada for His Majesty the King and his successors forever, all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands included within the following limits. Then they describe the limits. And His Majesty in return agrees with the said Indians that they shall have the right to pursue their usual vocations of hunting, trapping, and fishing throughout the tract surrendered as heretofore described. Subject, this is, remember Reverend Reverend Renison said, wait a minute, I looked at the written treaty and it has this thing in it, subject to such regulations as may from time to time be made by the government of the country, acting under the authority of His Majesty, and saving and accepting such tracts as may be required or taken up from time to time for settlement, mining, lumbering, trading, or other purposes. His Majesty agrees that, to set aside reserves. The location of these reserves is going to be arranged between His Majesty's commissioners and the chiefs and headmen. And the simple terms, he, the king, wished them to be happy and prosperous. If they entered the treaty, they would be protected. That's the end of my presentation. I honestly could go on for another 4 hours about this, or 5 hours. There's so much packed in each one of these ideas. But what I really was hoping to get across today was the fact that Duncan Campbell Scott, the lead commissioner himself, said the Aboriginal people could not have understood this court case thing about Aboriginal title. They couldn't have understood what was being agreed to between Ontario and Canada. All we could do was explain in the simplest terms what this treaty was about. And that makes me focus on those words that were being told at each place. The generous king has sent us all this way. He wants you to be happy and prosperous. And to me, that is the simple terms of Treaty 9. Thanks very much for bearing with me, guys.
Janet,
Yes.
will you be open for some questions?
Yes, definitely.
If there's anyone who hasn't.
I'll be available tomorrow too if you want to take some time. Also, I think my presentation is available for handout.
Anybody got any questions?
One
One over here.
I'm from Mishkigogman. I present myself as a knowledge keeper. The reason why I don't have a question, but seeing this presentation, when they say that we don't know, we don't have no structure. We do have governance in our traditional territories. There are teachings that we still have. The things that's happening today, we see a lot of, we're losing young people. We had those teachings, the prevention teachings, sexual abuse that's happening. We had those teachings already before residential schools happened. We knew how to provide space to respect a sibling. Our mother taught us these things. Our dad taught us about the land. And they had to look at the land before they travel. They know where the medicines were. It's not just a little box of a reserve. Our medicines could be further, maybe 45 miles radius. And then when we do traditional activities, I grew up going to wild rice picking since the time that I can remember, and also trapping. There's a lot of teachings there, the river systems. And it's huge. When we traveled a few days. And along the way, there's teachings. The base, every land has a story. So when those people that came to interpret us, they didn't know our story. What I'm grateful for when the king sent them to make sure that we're all right. And my question is today, I would like to know what's going on in the global area. Why they want our resources. Why we need to know that. We need to know why. I took schooling. What I was told when I took this training in the global area, that's where they want wide the resources. It distribute to the other areas. Is this why we starting to see wars? I would like to, as First Nations, as a First Nation woman here, witnessing all that stuff that's happening in our communities, I would like to question those people that are higher up. What's going on? Why do you want those resources? Tell us. We know that we know what we can say to protect our land. Because our land is very sacred. It's a healing for us. I know what they're looking at. They're looking at underground. When they came, when those commissioners came. So when they came many years ago, what they were looking at, we know their greed. So as First Nations, we are rich, but we've been put down like housing all across Canada. The homelessness. So that's what I want to ask, why are they doing that to us? How come they cannot afford to give us housing? Every First Nations 10 houses for one reserve. So why is that happening? This is why we see what's happening here. I would like to know why, because why are those people doing human trafficking? There's something wrong with this picture. That's all I want to say for now. Thank you.
Miigwech. I just have one comment. I know you weren't posing a question, but you're reminding me of something I could have said earlier in the presentation. When non-native people came to see the land, came to take treaty, their view of land at the time, and still today, land equals money to a non-native person. To the newcomers, when they see land, and this is actually all over their diaries, they see something that they need to, and they use the word tame, T-A-M-E. They need to tame the land. In other words, the land has to be changed or altered by newcomers. Cut the trees down, get the minerals out, because the land equals money. Like whatever's in that land is worth money. So First Nation people have a totally different view of land, obviously. Like the speaker said, the land is spiritual. The land is everything. But to the newcomer, the land is money. And I would argue, I'm carefully thinking about this. I'm a historian and a political scientist, so I don't really focus on international things going on today, but I would argue that that view of land by the newcomers is still prevalent today. And I believe when newcomers enter traditional territories, they don't see the healing or the spirituality of it. They see the money value of the resources. With respect to international events, I think I'd have to turn it over to somebody on the NAN executive, because I sort of just focus on past events. But thank you very much for those comments.
Yes, good morning. My tag says elder. I'll make a statement first and I want to ask a question, specific question. I see on this writing that Ontario is involved with Treaty 9. If we understand the Canada Act, only Canada is allowed to enter into treaties, and the provinces like Ontario have to speak to Canada on those treaties. That's what I understand about the Canada Act. Ontario does not have the power to enter into any treaties. They have to, any treaties they go have to be done by Canada. I wanted to make that distinction. That's the way I understand the Canada Act. And no matter how much work they've done in terms of writing out Treaty 9, for me, I always look at them as the writers. They have no jurisdiction whatsoever with the James Bay Treaty. It's only Canada that should be there, and even Canada is suspect in terms of their involvement with Treaty 9. The question I have to ask is at Moose Factory at the 2025 QO, and I asked a question, and I ask it here again. What is one of the main differences between the 1905-1906 agreement that comes here first on this booklet, and where I come in as the 1929 adhesion? What is the major difference? And believe it or not, nobody answered me. The only one that answered was one of the staff. And it's written on there that major differences, waters is mentioned in the adhesion that I belong to. And I've always wondered, how do we use that? How do we use that between the two 1905, 1906, and 1929, 30 portions? How do we use that difference? I'm very interested in how we respond to that. Why is there a difference, and how do we use it? In terms of the original 1905-06, and then where we come in. I used to have a friend. He was a chief at Muskegee, late Roy, and he used to tell me, "You're nothing but an adhesion." Something that was an afterthought. That's what he used to tell me. But when I go through this treaty document, I find that I'm very important, and this is one of them. how do we use that for our benefit? Thank you very much.
Miigwech, thank you. I'm very aware of what you're what you're asking about, and I remember talking with Chief Kaminawash many years ago about this exact same thing. In fact, that was one of the things that inspired me to do my dissertation for my PhD was water rights. So the adhesions to Treaty 9, they include the same things as the original treaty with one important distinction, like you were saying, Elder. It says, it describes a territory that's going to be covered by the treaty, north of the Albany River all the way to Hudson's Bay, with this important wording. It's going to include on the east by the waters of James Bay and including all islands, islets, and rocks, waters and land covered by water within the said limits, and also the said Indian rights, titles, and privileges to all other lands and lands covered by water, wherever situated in the Dominion of Canada. So that wording about water is not included in the original 1905 treaty, nor will you find it in any of the number treaties prior to the adhesions. In some of the pre-Confederation treaties, water is included specifically, but not in the numbered treaties. And the question, and Chief Kaminawash posed it to me as well, how can we use this? Because his thinking was, if water's specifically included in the 1929 adhesions, doesn't that mean it wasn't included in 1905? I'm not a lawyer, and I think Mr. Sherry is there. He can give you a much better legal answer. But in my opinion, I think it's really important because when the First Nations in 1905 were taking treaty, the word water was not even mentioned. So I think we can assert with confidence, not only was it understood that people were being asked to surrender land, but definitely not surrendering water, because that wasn't even brought up. I'll leave it to the lawyers about what you can do with it, but one of the things I discovered in my research was the reason this water stuff is included in the later treaty, in the 1929-30 treaty, is because by this point, governments are very aware of the value of hydropower, and they're very aware of the value of minerals on the bottom of the lake or the water bed. So by 1929, especially in Northern Ontario, they want to ensure that they, in their minds, are grabbing title to any land that could potentially hold minerals. That's the best I can do as a historian, but I would definitely ask Mr. Sherry or any other lawyer there to offer the rest about what we can do with it. Thank you.
Hi, it's me, Mike here. It's been a long time since I've been called Mr. Sherry, but thanks a lot for that, Dr. Janet. So yeah, I mean, it's as we laid out, it creates a very strong, valid argument that that Aboriginal title to water was not surrendered in the 0506 portion of the treaty. It's a logical, strong argument, and NAN has done work on it in the past, so it's not a new issue. Like Janet and I have talked about it many years ago. So it's there. But it's not black and white. Like all these issues are complicated because I know one thing that's been said in terms of the other side of the argument is that the estimated surface area of Treaty Number 9, 0506 only makes sense if water is included. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that in the 0506, you do have references to water in the sense of the exclusion of hydropower sites over 500 HP. So that would tend to suggest that water was thought of, but I'm not trying to be negative about it because these things are, it's never black and white, it's never simple, but there is a strong argument along those lines based on the difference, the wording, for sure.
Thank you.
Morris?
Oh,
Bonjour. Shkigagag, Disneykas, Dizyanakas, Mainganzotem. My name is Morris Wapus. I'm not representing anybody by attending here. I am a member of Nishkandaga First Nation, formerly Lansdowne House. Okay. I hope I was heard earlier. Anyway, I want to acknowledge the drum and the prayer from Ben. Thank you. I guess the presentation was very interesting. And supposedly, I guess our treaty signing was held in Port Hope, Edmonton, and when the treaty was paid out, you mentioned $8 at first, and then $4 annually from there. And I'm just thinking here that thinking out loud, I guess, in terms of the people were paid that attended the treaty signing, but there was people that weren't there. There was a lot of people living in Lansdowne House area that possibly weren't able to make it to the treaty signing in Port Hope. So, and what happened was, a lot of people went back to that area, and our reserve status remained in Port Hope. And it says that in your presentation that 1 square mile for every family of 5. What about the increase in population? Was that taken into consideration, or what happens to people that lived in Lansdowne House, Webber and even in McCain? They were also part of Port Hope signing there, eh? And we lived remotely, I guess, with no reservation for about 80 years, so something along that line. So in Nishkandaga, we received our reserve in, I believe, in 86. But before that, we were satellite community, and so I just wanted to find out how that works, because I think the mistake was made back in 1905 by the government, not recognizing every Indian, I guess, as we were called, back then, and to have same entitlement as, where the signing took place, So when I was a leader or a chief back in '85, I started looking at this process, thinking that, we didn't get a fair deal. So, but my thinking or my approach was lost in the shuffle, because the change of leadership beyond that. So, but I'm still concerned about this this issue. And because I am a member, I am a treaty person, and I just need to know, you know, some answers, I guess, in terms of that thing that was done, you know, back in 1905. And so I see that in the picture there's a lot of bannock. I thought I was the first one making that stuff, but I was wrong. Okay, amigas, thank you.
Yeah.
Miigwech. Yes, the treaty land entitlement issue in Treaty 9 is a huge issue. I actually worked on your Treaty 9 and treaty land entitlement claim or for Yabmatung. So I'm very aware of these people at Lansdowne that were missed, and so were the commissioners. When the commissioners visited Fort Hope, they were aware that over half of the First Nation was away. What they did, they estimated or guessed at how many people were not there. So when they were counting up all the people on the pay list, they said, yeah, there's a bunch missing. And they just guessed and determined the size of the reserve based on a guess. But the writing that they put in their documents was the size of the Fort Hope Reserve is going to be determined later because we know over half of the band is missing. I'm having trouble remembering the exact number of people we calculated, but we did go through, we meaning NAN, we went through and counted all the people that were missing and how much land was owed. I don't know what happened since then. We submitted the report to your First Nation, but I don't really know what happened since then. Luke might know. But yes, you're correct. And not only were half the people missing, but I believe the man who was elected chief was also not there at the time. So thank you for the question, because you're reminding me of something else I wanted to highlight. When the commissioners visited each place, they had, prior to that, they had sent out their itinerary to the Hudson's Bay Company. And they said, will you please post this itinerary at your post so people know when to come see us? And the Hudson's Bay Company, for the most part, did that. Unfortunately, due to travel hazards and all kinds of other things, the commissioners were more than 1 week late. Now, that might not seem like a lot today if you're, traveling by plane and you're being housed. But 1 week late to First Nations people that have traveled all the way from their traditional grounds to come see you, that's a big deal, because it means when you get there, you have to feed yourself for a whole week. So if you've only planned on being there for a day or two and returning, you would not have brought the provisions you needed. It also means the people that had come to see you couldn't wait that long. So that many of them had left, because after a week, they've been fishing to survive, but they're not prepared for a whole week's wait. So it was another sort of gaffe on the part of the treaty commissioners that they were that late. And that is also why many of the people at each post, it was at Yabmatung, but it was at other places too, almost half the band was missing, including at Wapiskat. So thank you for the question. I can try and find out what's going on with your treaty land entitlement claim if you would like and get back to you. Thank you.
Brenda? I know Ron first. There's two more after that, and then we'll break for lunch. Okay, Ron?
Hello, my name is Ron Wesley. I'm from Constance Lake First Nation, and I sit on the Land Use Planning Committee. And we were talking at a meeting one time, and first of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was educating, and I had to ask you 1,000 questions. But You know, we were at a land use committee meeting and we were talking with the government feds, I mean, bureaucrats, I guess you can call them. And, you know, we get into heated exchange with the government officials. And we were talking about what this lawyer was talking about, the water and we ceded and surrendered the land. You know, that's what you said, your interpretation of the land and this and that were ceded and surrendered. But was there any documentation saying that we surrendered the waters and the land underneath? Is there I never see that in any presentation because all those lands underneath the waters that no one owns, according to this lawyer, no one owns the land, the water, no one owns, but the land underneath, has this been surrendered and ceded to? That's my question.
Miigwech, that's a very good question. It's actually a legal question in many regards, but as far as what the First Nations understanding was, there would be no understanding of surrendering land underwater. It was never discussed. It was never raised. I will caution, though, one might think, therefore, that the commissioners themselves didn't think about it. But in Treaty 3, so back in 1873, prior to Treaty 9, the Crown was very concerned about water because what that treaty involved was the water route through the rivers that the Canadian military needed to travel from Ottawa and the east out to Red River to suppress the rebellion. So they were very aware about water and their travel rights through waterways. One cannot say that, therefore, that in 1905 the government wasn't aware of it, and therefore they didn't make the distinction. They were fully aware of it. It just was not specifically included in the written text, nor was it discussed. Until 1929, it appears in the text. There's no evidence that in 1929 it was actually discussed when the treaty terms were being discussed. So that's as far as I can go myself, unless Mike wants to add.
Sure. In terms of documentation, I think, you know, the documentation would support the First Nation position because the difference in the wording, like it's there's no reference to land underwater and water, islands, rocklets, and so forth in 0506, but it is there in the adhesion. So the documentation supports the First Nation position that it was not surrendered in the 0506, and also it's supported by interpretation principles. Is that, you know, the treaties, according to the courts, the treaties are supposed to be interpreted in a liberal manner in favor of First Nations whenever possible. And this is a case where, as you know, Janet so carefully laid out, that the documentation was prepared by the feds in Ontario and their lawyers, and that supports another interpretation principle in this kind of a document, where the interpretation goes against the drafter, because the drafting process was controlled by the feds in the province. So if they made a mistake in the drafting, it's sort of like, you know, one way to put it is it's too bad for them. They made a mistake. They made a mistake in the draft, or, you know, they didn't put that wording in, whereas they put it in later, and therefore it supports the argument that the Aboriginal title survives. So according the wordings, the black and white wording supports the position. Also, I guess the First Nation understanding, as Janice laid out, and then on top of that, interpretation principles support it. But just the final caveat, though, that it's not. This is a huge issue, right? So it's not simple.
Hello. My name is Brenda Fox. I'm from Michigammon First Nation. I guess one of the questions that I had in regards to history is a very important foundational pieces of who we are, but at the same time, the capture of our true oral history is not it's not written. You know, the treaties and whatnot, the way that they were signed, and I guess the thought of chief and council, that is not how we governed ourselves. Like my colleague here was saying, we had our own systems, our own governing systems. I think for me anyways, I want to recommend this to all historians that You know, I think about the future of my granddaughter. You know, my granddaughter is going to be getting her first driver's license. You know, I would like to make sure that the foundational pieces of who she is as a Native woman should stay intact. And that is writing our oral history of what our understanding of the treaty was. I think that's where we kind of miss out on a lot of things because nothing is written to say, you know what, it took four clan members or whatever to ask Masabe to try and interpret what they were signing. You know, there is an oral history to these pictures of these feasts. They had meetings before all these things happened, or even before that person came. So I think, for me, anyways, I think the foundation of history should be based in the communities and where we came from. And like this gentleman in front of me said that they didn't take an account of other people in other communities because we were connected by the waterways and the water systems, like you said. And we, in the whole land, like, you know, none of us, we made a promise to the Creator, take care of the land for the generations to come. That's what was promised to me. You know, I'm happy that my father still traps and hunted for me to learn the land and the language. So what we're losing is the history, the culture, the language, and the education need to be intact, and it has to be done in a way that we have to go to Canada and say we're going to do an oral history on our interpretation, because everything was a violation, because they held the pen, they held the language. We didn't know that because our word was a promise and it was solid. A handshake or whatever, if you shared food, it was always going to be that you made a promise to that. But anyways, that's just my thought. And the other question that I had for you in regards to um Chief Roy Kamnawash of Mishkigogmang, he was of a big influence to me in some of the things that he had said, especially in quotes, because even then he was already thinking of the future of how our communities were going to become. And one of the things that he said, and I'm looking for this quote and nobody wants to give it to me, and I've been bugging NAN and whatnot. Anyhow, it was a quote that he made when Tikanagan was, they did it's a child welfare issue. He made a comment in an interview. He said that we're only moving white faces to brown faces, meaning that we are still going to be under the ministry guidelines of child welfare. I am looking for that quote. I'm looking for that interview. If you could find that, please hook me up. Thank you.
Miigwech, I know that quote. I'll look for it. Thank you.
Okay, Adam, take it all away.
Okay, Miguel, I know it's lunchtime. I'll try and make it short. Janet, it's Adam Fiddler. Really good to see you and great presentation. Just really quick question, probably just a short answer. But from your presentation, what you're saying is what's written in the treaty is different from the understanding of our elders. When they had the discussion about treaty, it's different from what's written. And the journals and the diaries prove that what was actually said at the time of signing is different than what's written in the treaty. My question is, just because I'm presenting this afternoon, I'm going to be speaking about Treaty 5. I know you know about Treaty 5 as well. Can the same be said about Treaty 5? That what was actually spoken and said is different than what's written in the actual treaty? And your screen froze, I think. Oh, there you
No,
are.
Miigwech, and
Maybe you froze.
the answer is yes, absolutely. It can be said with respect to Treaty 5. In fact, in Treaty 5, we have the example of the commissioners wrapping Chief Fiddler with the British flag and very explicitly stating, "We are here to protect you." There was no mention of the harvesting clause or of surrender. It's exactly the same playbook that they used. But thanks for the question.
Lucy, can you bless the food?
Bless or say the prayer? Prayer? Because, sit down, sit down. A pick. Mwana ni na naman natin mana ewa magagwana ka na kani pojek. Pomashe mstigano ke mitsiak. Unos to tamok weskach. Kiste weskach den. Che ni pojek pomashe yapechek. Depanach pago yaw. Demistigechek. Min kweste dochek. Kishemanto. Which mi quest twitchik. Mi quest Muska Jonah Beggars gone to Schnehasen. Na mewn do dem Lucy Long Peter and de Schnehasen. And did de gios joke no hamapan na moshopan ante adopas katehe James Bay. No hamarina gios joke gohitehe. Da shenengas gissen yaw. Mi gweste den de mane gio fagahedjik. E gwane jiki en ni mo yan dina. Nagaspogwa de donna nama. Ano ashamaga tamija sananon. Extenda gon mane jamija sanano. Kegwan eyamanano ke extenda go. E kumaga despen mon de ton mi gweste tau kishemento e mam hoetia kanoska gishagak. Epeche dochter ma ke goan met jene ga gestenta gut ni kan tep weskat ga gispeche schnago Nishnabeski. Eko shemaga mi gwest don mis te ga ye big. Oh, mi gwest.
Thank you, Lucy. Okay, we'll break for lunch and we'll be back at 1:15.
They're not. They're not allowed to go inside when they're either so sleep in the school stairs. Or outside. Side one.
Just but it's cool. The lawyer stuff, some stuff that doesn't go by, but I can tell the election is about that. Yeah. Like mayo or something. No, I don't mind that for myself. Thinking of student level. But I did. So. They're quite enough to a certain day, certain anyone from that have the benefit from the tech, refer to you. Is like the. You were on. I think the number shut down. Yeah, sure. So we really have to go like that, because they actually have to see. Some are some very, they're going to grab an speech fest. Oh, maybe not. I'm thinking which. Now, sorry. Just go around. If there's no conversation, then to have that. The rubbers, there's no one table. I'll try it, that's about that. Always good to have to.
My sister Erin is the only one that had my mom died. And moved them in very small. Yeah. So that's the thing, so that's it. Like, you know, with this Richmond situation. That's what I'm saying, we didn't know, just like, God, and I'm like, I was in this right now. So, no, but we didn't know. No, I got excused, like, you know, where that happened. But it's, I don't think it'd be, more than David's, I should get along out there. Yeah, for. Now that you're gonna live plus the. Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah. They're both good. Both sides, right? Yeah. That, yeah. So, right. Yeah. And then, but I mean, like, oh, okay. Yeah. When I saw that. I feel that she. But not going out like that, it's allergies. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely not. The last time she did like something. They always did. And this is. For the outside of my mouth. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. That's what we were doing. Was yesterday. And what is that gonna mean? Because there's now, and where's what? So it was like 6 months later. Yeah, and they always go for our ways that.